So a story has been circulating on the internet, which means it has to be true, right? Right? And this is from an actual Associated Press news story from 1999. And we're going to pick on, unfortunately, a resident of California, Pastor Matt. It's not you, but Linda Burnett, 23, a resident of San Diego, was visiting her in-laws, and while there went to a nearby grocery store to pick up some groceries. Several people noticed her sitting in her car with her windows rolled up and her eyes closed, with both hands behind the back of her head. One customer who had been in the store for a while became concerned and walked over to her car. He noticed that Linda's eyes were now wide open, but she looked rather strange. He asked her if she was okay, and Linda replied that she had been shot in the back of the head and had been holding her brains in for over an hour. The man called the paramedics, who broke into the car because the doors were locked, and Linda, of course, refused to remove her hands from her head. When they finally got in, they found that Linda had been shot. She had a wad of bread dough on the back of her head. A Pillsbury biscuit can had exploded because of the heat, making a loud noise that sounded like a gunshot, and the wad of dough hit her in the back of the head. When she reached back to find out what it was, she felt the dough and thought it was her brains. She initially passed out, but quickly recovered and tried to hold her brains in for over an hour until someone finally noticed. I am sure and hopeful that Linda was slightly embarrassed when she realized what really had happened. But in her defense, she was only acting on what she could feel from her perspective. Perspective. Meaningful, isn't it? According to Webster's dictionary, perspective is a particular attitude toward or way of regarding something, a point of view. Perspective is what causes two separate people to see or experience the exact same thing and come away with two separate opinions about what had just happened. Perspective. We get a lot of perspectives in today's world, don't we? I've always found people's perspective on things to be pretty interesting. And this was before COVID or the recent presidential election. A lot of different perspectives. I think back to my time as a high school coach before we moved here to Spencer, and it's always interesting to me to see how people, and especially high school kids, would respond in certain situations. In basketball, it was always fascinating to see how a team would respond to an official's call that didn't go the way they wanted it to go, or maybe losing on a last-second bucket, or maybe winning on a free throw made with no time on the clock. All of those were interesting perspectives that for one team was a good thing, and for another team was a bad thing. The same situation, but it all depended on your perspective. It all depends on your perspective. I do remember after one game, actually it was on a bus ride home, talking to one of the players, and I at that time was guilty of crossing the separation of church and state, and shared a Bible verse with that player. I don't remember the specifics of that game. I really don't remember what had happened. Knowing the player I was visiting with, they took things really hard when things didn't go the way they wanted them to go. So maybe it was a loss, maybe it was a poor performance. But the verse I shared was Ecclesiastes 7:14. When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this: God has made one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. I remember sharing that verse with with that athlete at that time, and I remember immediately the response. Well, what does that mean? I think we all think that sometimes about Bible verses. What does that mean? What does that verse mean? When times are good, be happy, but when times are bad, consider this: God has made the one as well as the other. Well, I think it means this. It means that we as Christians need to radically change our view of what happens to us on a daily basis. This one verse makes it clear that God is in control of every circumstance that happens to us, and that probably it's we as humans who are the ones who label it good or bad. You ever thought about that before? We as humans are probably the ones that categorize something as being good or bad. God has no label. This verse tells us that he creates both, right? He has made one as well as the other. He has no label. Everything he orchestrates in our lives is really done for one thing. It's not done for good. It's not done for bad. It's done to change us to be more like Jesus. Everything is really being done according to Romans 8:28. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. So how do we achieve this radical change of view? Well, I think it starts with a radical change in a question. When tough things happen or bad things happen, our natural response is this: why did God allow this to happen? Why did God allow this to happen? I can't understand. Why would God allow this to happen? Instead, however, I think a better question we need to ask is this: what is God doing through this difficult circumstance? What is God doing through this difficult circumstance? Imagine with me a large rock in the middle of an empty field. Sitting there by itself, that rock is ordinary, maybe it's overlooked, and without much use. If you're a farmer, that rock is in the way, right? There's really not much to that rock sitting in the middle of an empty field. But in the hands of the right person, like a sculptor, it can become a masterpiece. Our lives are a lot like that rock. Even though we can't see it now, God has been busy creating something in us. Through everything you've endured, through every situation you've faced in your life, even that very confusing situation you're facing right now, the problem is we can't see what he is doing while it is happening. All we see are the chips flying. I think you've all seen a sculptor work and the chips that fly off their chisel as they're creating that artwork. And that's really where we don't get it. The flying chips from the chisel are not evidence that God has left us or that he's angry with us. They are evidence that God is right there with us, eyeing our progress, smoothing the rough edges, patiently bringing us to the image of Jesus in us. Let's look at that a different way. And so turn with me to Joshua 3. I'm going to go to the Old Testament, to Joshua 3. And let me set the scene with you in Joshua 3. For more than 400 years, the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt. We're all familiar with the story of Moses and the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea. Because of disobedience to God, however, the journey to their freedom took 40 years instead of the month it should have taken. And in Joshua 3, the story picks up in verse 2. We'll read verses 2 through 14. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you." Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on ahead of the people." So they took it up and went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the ark of the covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river." Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe, and as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap." So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. We think about more than 1 million Israelites standing on the banks, eagerly listening to Joshua's instructions. After 40 years, tomorrow is finally the day. The ark of the covenant will go first. We will follow, but tomorrow is finally the day. I'm sure, though, anticipation was dampened when they looked in front of them. Look at verse 15. They would not be crossing the Jordan during a drought. Verse 15 says this: "Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho." Did you catch that there at the end? As soon as the priests touched the water stopped flowing. Did God stop the water right in front of them so that they could see his awesome power? No. Did he stop the water right before their eyes so he could know exactly what he was doing? No. This verse tells us that the water piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam. Bible scholars estimate that the town of Adam was 16 miles away. 16 miles away. The people couldn't really see what God was doing at all. He was working too far upstream. He was working 16 miles upstream. And that same truth that the Israelites learned on that day is true today in our lives. God is always at work upstream in our lives. Whenever we face a problem in our lives, sickness, job loss, depression, tragedy, confusion, discouragement, things not going our way, the list goes on and on. God is always at work upstream in those situations, often just beyond our line of sight. All the Israelites could see was a raging river. And the natural human response was to say, well, God doesn't care about us. He's not actively involved. But the reality is, he was there. They just couldn't see him. It's no different in any of our lives. God is there. God is here. And he is working. However, believing that he is working is another thing. Waiting on God's timing can be frustrating, especially when we're waiting on that doctor's report, or we're waiting to hear back from that someone who has an answer for us, or we're waiting for good news, or we're waiting to get that new job. Waiting can be frustrating. But Hebrews tells us about faith. And let's turn now to Hebrews 11. I told you we'd be jumping around a little bit today. And I apologize for those in the sanctuary this morning who are part of youth group, because you're getting tired of Hebrews 11. We're there every week in youth. But as I said, it's God is always at work, although we can't see him. But we have to believe that he is at work. And that belief that he is at work is faith. And look at Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. We've been working with the junior high and high school kids to come up with that definition of what really is faith. Well, it's confidence in what we hope for. What do we hope for today? We hope for heaven. As we just talked about earlier in the children's moment, Christ is coming back, and we hope for that peace that he brings. So faith is confidence in what we hope for. It's assurance about what we do not see. The ESV version uses the word conviction, which I really like. If you're convicted of something, there's a 100% chance that you did it, right? You're convicted. So faith is the conviction about what we do not see. What do we not see as Christians? We talk about this a lot with the high school kids. We don't physically see Jesus. We don't physically see God, but we have 100% conviction, 100% assurance that he is there, that he is working. So what is a true faith response then? A true faith response to whatever it is that God has you going through is this: I can't understand why this is happening, but I'm sure there is a reason for it. I can't understand why this is happening, but I am sure there is a reason for it. I may not find out tomorrow. I may find out 25 years from now, or I may not find out until I die. But one day, this will all make sense. And until it does, I'm going to give this problem to God, because I know he is working. He might just be working upstream. He is working, but he might just be working upstream. So the question then really rests with us. Do we believe it? Do we really believe that God is working upstream? Do we really believe that God is chiseling us into a sculpture, as I talked about that rock earlier? Do we really believe that he is working upstream? And this morning, as a Christian, we really have no choice. Because to not believe that he is working in our lives, even unseen, is to not believe that God is in control. He might just be working upstream. I want to close this morning, and you're saying close, and yes, I'm putting the pressure on Kurt again. That's what happens when you don't go to Bible college and be a real preacher. You don't preach as long. But I want to close this morning with a story, and this story is rather lengthy. And I will preface this by saying it's a sad story, but it really shows us how God is at work upstream. And this comes from a small-town newspaper in Missouri, the Neosho Daily News, and it's an article from about 10 years ago, but it's telling you a story from about 20 years ago. In the summer of 1999, Heather was ready to have the time of her life. Her father walked her down the aisle as she married James Brill. She would graduate the next spring, and she had big dreams. And the next year, though, everything would change to shatter those dreams. 3 months after her wedding to James, her father died. He had had a stroke nearly 10 years before, and although it was a rocky road, his health had steadily improved. When he contracted pneumonia, doctors tried to prepare the family for the worst. They had heard so many times that there was no hope. Only this was the one time her father did not rebound. And in October of 1999, he passed away. Heather began to struggle with her faith, facing depression and bitterness after her father's passing. A situation we've all been in where it was hard to believe that God could be working upstream in a time of loss. She had been raised to believe in God, raised in a Christian home, but she now had doubts. I began to question God and whether or not I wanted to believe in him, she said. And even if it was true and there really was a God out there, I didn't know if I liked him. I wanted to see him working, doing the good things. I didn't know if I wanted to follow him. That spring, she and her husband, James, graduated from Southwest Baptist University. In the fall, James planned to go to seminary, but for the summer, they put their things in storage and they moved to Vermont. Heather's sister and her husband, Scott, were starting a Christian adventure camp, a ministry to get kids out of the inner city and get them in rural Vermont to learn about nature and camping and hiking and canoeing and kayaking. The campers were arriving, and so Heather's husband, James, and her brother-in-law, Scott, James and Scott, left to scout for a canoe trip the next day. They got in their canoes and were going to scout a portion of the river that they were going to take kids on the next day, but by dark, they had not returned. We went to bed not knowing where they were, Heather said. It was 9 p.m. the next day when we found out. So it was a full day of search parties going out and their vehicles and their pictures on the news and people trying to find them. Scott and James were missing for 24 hours before searchers found them in the river. 1 month after Heather's 1-year anniversary, she was a widow, and her sister was as well. And this was not how she imagined her life would be. Poof, all the hopes you've built upon, all the dreams you've already dreamed, they've just been snatched away from you, she said. In the middle of the pain and the whys, she came to a crossroad, a moment similar to each of us in situations in our lives where she felt she had to decide if she believed there was a God and if they were on the same team. The question of, what we've just talked about this morning, is God really at work upstream? She chose God. It was really at a point, instead of running as hard and as fast as I possibly could away from him, I made a choice in my heart to run as hard and fast as I possibly could toward him, she said. I made a decision. I'm going to find out who this God is, and I'm really going to start seeking answers. She admits that she had to force herself to read the Bible. If these promises did not hold true, she would be done. Was God really going to be the healer of the brokenhearted? He never let me down, she said. I remember that day 20 years ago when Heather called me to tell me about James's death. James was my college roommate. And I remember asking that question, why did God allow a 25-year-old man who was going into full-time ministry to drown in a river? Why? But as I mentioned earlier, that is the wrong question. The question I needed to ask is, what is God going to do through that difficult circumstance? And in the 20 years since James's passing, Heather and her sister have traveled throughout the United States, speaking to groups about their story, and countless people have come to Christ because of James's death. God is always working upstream. There's a quote by Oswald Chambers I really like. Our lives are in the hands of God like a bow and arrow is in the hands of a hunter. God is aiming at something you cannot see, and he keeps stretching and pulling, and every now and then you say, I can't take it anymore. But God does not listen. He goes on stretching until his purpose and plan for you is in sight, and then he lets you fly. Trust yourself in God's hands. Trust yourself in God's hands. When we aren't sure what he is doing, we can be confident that he is working upstream. You're probably thinking, what an odd message in December. Shouldn't have been something about Christmas. And even in this Christmas season, even in this time of celebrating God's ultimate work of being upstream, really think about the whole Christmas story from the perspective of God working upstream. Jesus was not who the Israelites thought he was going to be. Jesus was not born in a way that a king should have been born. God was working upstream. We must evaluate ourselves. Whatever difficulty we're going through, do we really believe that God is working upstream? Because he is. I promise he is.